So I imagine you're surprised that I actually got around to trying to do this. But I'd like to talk to you a few minutes about the opening section of Anne Carson's autobiography of Red, to kind of get you started in what is a little bit, I think, a strange text. Um, if you look at your copy, you'll find that there's a beginning section that seems to be an essay that Anne Carson has written that gives a little background. I think that's a very interesting piece. It's very brilliant. It's a little bit a parody of an academic piece while also offering some really serious points. But I'm going to guess that maybe you're a little busy right now and maybe you won't get to it. Uh, I'd like to just focus in on a section about halfway through. Anne Carson writes, Geryon is the name of a character in ancient Greek myth about whom Stesichorus, that's the poet we're talking about, wrote a very long lyric poem. Uh, the verses tell of a strange winged red monster who lived on an island called Erythea, which is an adjective meaning simply the red place. Anne Carson, by the way, is a well regarded and recognized scholar of Greek and Roman antiquity. Um, Geryon was tending a herd of magical red cattle until one day the hero Heracles came across the sea and killed him to get the cattle. There were many different ways to tell a story like this. Heracles was an important Greek hero, and the elimination of Geryon constituted one of his celebrated labors. If Stesichorus had been a more conventional poet, he might have taken the point of view of Heracles and framed a thrilling account of the victory of culture over monstrosity. Now, I think that's rather telling, culture over monstrosity. But instead, the extant fragments of Stesichorus' poem offer a tantalizing cross-section of scenes, both proud and pitiful, from Geryon's own experience. We see his red boy's life and his little dog, a scene of wild appeal from his mother which breaks off, interspersed shots of Heracles approaching over the sea, a flash of the gods in heaven pointing to Geryon's doom, the battle itself, the moment when everything goes suddenly slow and Heracles' arrow divides Geryon's skull. We see Heracles kill the little dog with his famous club. That's a terrible point. Heracles actually kills the dog. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of background here. The next section is actually Anne Carson's translation of the fragments of Stesichorus' poem. Again, they would, I think, be interesting for you to read, but I also wonder if you're not, as I said, a little busy. So move through that, and we come to the actual beginning of. Uh, uh, there's a couple of appendixes, actually, but we eventually get to the autobiography of Red, a romance, as Anne Carson titles it. And I just like to read with you the very beginning section to think a little bit. So the first section is called Justice, which may be telling. Maybe this work will think a little bit about the idea of what is meant by justice. And there's an opening line. Geryon learned about justice from his brother quite early. They used to go to school together. Geryon's brother was bigger and older. He walked in front, sometimes broke into a run or dropped on one knee to pick up a stone. Stones make my brother happy, thought Geryon, and he studied stones as he trotted along behind. So many different kinds of stones, the sober and the uncanny, lying side by side in the red dirt, to stop and imagine the life of each one. Now they were sailing through the air from a happy arm. What a fate. Geryon hurried on. So I think it's pretty clear we're talking about a young child's viewpoint, and as you read on, you'll recognize that this is probably about a sort of kindergartner heading to school, really at the beginning of their schooling experience. So I think to go back to those lines, you start with Geryon learned about justice from his brother quite early. I wonder if that's the case, that we all learn about justice quite early from very specific circumstances in our lives having to do with family and people close to us in that way. That's the first experience of justice, the most basic experience of justice. There's the older brother. Uh, who basically is picking up a stone, and you get a sense right away that Geryon maybe thinks in a little bit of an odd way, maybe the way children sometimes think. For him, the stones are almost like living things, which I believe, if you think back to your own very early experience, you may have also thought of the world in this way. I think there's this particular time where we begin to understand that the whole world isn't alive in the same way. But as a very young child, it's very possible to think of everything as having a kind of life. Now, when we get to the line, now they were sailing through the air from a happy human arm, I'm thinking that probably those stones were being thrown at the little brother, because it has been known in the past that big brothers will sometimes throw rocks at little brothers. I don't know if that's absolutely the case, but it would seem to me to be something that's going on there. Arrived at the schoolyard, he was focusing on his feet and his steps. Again, a very childish viewpoint. Just if you've ever seen a very young child walking along, sometimes they will watch their feet as though their feet are not really their own. Children poured around him, and the intolerable red assault of grass and the smell of grass everywhere was pulling him towards it like a strong sea. He could feel his eyes leaning out of his skull on their little connectors. He had to make it to the door. He had to not lose track of his brother. These two things. So I think this is a pretty interesting little depiction of what it might have been like for him and what it might have been like for many people when they're going to school for the first time. The sense of all of these children pouring into the building, the sense that you could easily get lost if you are with your older brother or sister, and you don't want to get lost and lose sight of them. So all of this seems to really fit the idea of a child experiencing this for the first time. School was a long brick building on a north-south axis, south main door through which all the boys and girls must enter. North kindergarten, its large round windows gazing onto the backwoods and surrounded by a hedge of high bush cranberry. Between the main door and kindergarten ran a corridor. To Geryon, it was 100,000 miles of thunder tunnels and indoor neon sky slammed open by giants. I'm going to suggest to you that that is a really wonderful line that gets across the sense of smallness that a child can feel, in the sense of the world being simply inhabited by giants and filled with giant things. He feels himself really sort of small and lost in this giant corridor. Hand in hand on the first day of school, so now we're learning this is the first day of school, Geryon crossed this alien terrain. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong. This is something that happened a little while before. Hand in hand on the first day of school, Geryon crossed this alien terrain with his mother. Then his brother performed the task day after day. But as September moved into October, an unrest was growing in Geryon's brother. Geryon had always been stupid, but nowadays the look in his eyes made a person feel strange. Just take me once more, I'll get it this time, Geryon would say. The eyes, terrible holes. Stupid, said Geryon's brother, and left him. Geryon had no doubt stupid was correct, but when justice is done, the world drops away. So I think a comment is being made about justice here that suggests that maybe there's not a lot of mercy in the justice of his brother. The brother feels annoyed to have to deal with his younger brother, and I think that's something that many people have experienced on either side of that divide. But the world itself maybe requires something more than justice. I think that's what might be being suggested there. He stood on his small red shadow and thought what to do next. Main door rose before him. Perhaps, peering hard, Geryon made his way through the fires in his mind to where the map should be. In place of a map of the school quarter lay a deep, glowing blank. Geryon's anger was total. The blank caught fire and burned to baseline. Geryon ran. After that, Geryon went to school alone. He did not approach the main door at all. Justice is pure. He would make his way around the long brick sidewall, past the window of 7th grade, 4th grade, 2nd grade, and boys to the north end of the school, and position himself in the bushes outside kindergarten. There he would stand motionless until someone inside noticed and came out to show him the way. He did not gesticulate. He did not knock on the glass. He waited, small, red, and upright. He waited, gripping his new book bag tight in one hand and touching a lucky penny inside his coat pocket with the other, while the first snows of winter floated down on his eyelashes and covered the branches around him and silenced all traces of the world. So there's the first chapter. We've been introduced to the monster Geryon as a child who is sort of overwhelmed by the experience of kindergarten and doesn't really know how to make his way in the world very well. As the chapters go on, we'll fill in more details about who Geryon is, and we know where this is headed. One day, a guy named Heracles is going to show up and is going to do away with Geryon. But we begin with this picture of a young child. So I hope that is a somewhat helpful set of ideas about getting started in this text. I'd like you to read, let's say, up through about let's go up through about chapter 9. Why don't you go up through about chapter 9? Yeah, that makes sense. And we'll take it from there. Okay, we'll see.